You shouldn't be here. David Thompson muttered, looking down at the alien girl lying in the snow, barely conscious. The blizzard howled around them, and the temperature had already dropped to below freezing. He should have kept moving, he told himself. His mission was clear, and time was short. But the sight of her, so vulnerable and abandoned, made it impossible to leave. The girl's skin shimmered faintly, a deep violet hue that caught the little light filtering through the storm. Her silvery hair was matted with ice, and her chest rose and fell weakly, struggling for breath. Her eyes, though clouded with pain, still held a fire, a sharpness that hinted at something more than the helplessness of her situation. David's boots crunched in the snow as he kneeled beside her. "Hey, stay with me," he whispered, checking for a pulse. His heart pounded in his chest. He could leave her, continue with his mission. No one would blame him. But he couldn't. He couldn't just walk away from someone in need, even if she wasn't human. Her eyes flickered open at the sound of his voice. They were bright, almost glowing with an otherworldly intensity. She tried to speak, but her words were slurred, barely audible over the howling wind. "You shouldn't. Help me," she gasped, each word like a struggle. David's chest tightened. "I'm not leaving you here," he said firmly, ripping open his emergency pack. He found a thermal blanket and wrapped it around her shivering body, his hands shaking with urgency. The storm was growing fiercer by the second. He couldn't stay out here long. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softening as he lifted her gently, trying to keep her upright. She blinked, confusion clouding her expression for a moment. "Alara," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "Alara," David repeated, committing the name to memory. She was barely conscious now, and her breathing was shallow. He knew he had to get her to shelter, fast. "I'm David," he said, almost to himself as he scanned the bleak landscape. The nearest settlement was miles away, but there was no choice. He picked her up, feeling her small, fragile frame in his arms. Her body was cold, colder than it should have been, and he could feel her shivering against him. He moved quickly, pushing forward through the snow, trying to ignore the ache in his muscles. He couldn't think about anything except getting her to safety. As he walked, Alara stirred, her eyes fluttering open again. This time, they locked onto his face, and for a moment, she seemed to focus. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice weak but curious. "You're not afraid?" David hesitated for a moment. He didn't know how to answer. "I don't leave people behind," he finally said, pushing through the blizzard. "Not even aliens." He could feel her eyes on him as he carried her. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken questions, and David couldn't help but wonder why she'd been left here, alone. But those questions could wait. He had to get her somewhere warm. The snow was falling harder now, and he had no idea what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long while, David wasn't thinking about his mission or the war. All he could think about was getting Alara through this storm. He wasn't about to let her die here. Not on his watch. David trudged through the snow, his boots crunching with each step as he carried Alara in his arms. The storm had only grown worse, the wind howling like a wild animal, tearing through his uniform and biting into his skin. But he barely noticed the cold anymore. All that mattered was getting her to shelter. Alara's body felt like ice in his arms, and each breath she took was a struggle, shallow and weak. He knew she wasn't going to make it much longer if he didn't find shelter soon. The wind howled louder, and for a moment, David thought he heard something behind them. He turned, eyes scanning the blizzard. There was nothing, just the endless white of the storm and the dark shadows of distant rocks. But his instincts, honed over years of battle, told him something was wrong. "Stay with me, Alara," he muttered, tightening his grip on her fragile form. She stirred slightly, her eyes flickering open again. I don't understand." Her voice was faint, almost drowned out by the wind. David slowed his pace for a moment, glancing down at her. "Don't talk. Just hold on." She blinked up at him, confusion and pain in her eyes. "Why are you doing this? I'm not one of your people." David gritted his teeth, the words barely escaping his mouth. "Because you're a living being, and you deserve to survive." The words sounded hollow even to him. The truth was, he didn't know why. He had always been a soldier, driven by duty, but this was different. It was the humanity inside him that refused to let go. "I won't leave you," he said softly, his voice steady despite the chaos of the storm around them. Alara didn't reply, her body shivering violently in his arms. David's muscles burned with the effort of carrying her through the deepening snow, but he didn't dare stop. He couldn't. Another few minutes passed, though it felt like an eternity. David's breath came in ragged gasps, and his vision blurred with the cold. But in the distance, through the haze of white, he spotted something. A building, dark and looming against the endless white landscape. Relief flooded through him, and he pushed forward, his steps quickening. As they neared the structure, David's legs felt like lead, his body trembling from exhaustion. But he didn't stop. The entrance was near, just a little further. The cold was unbearable, but they were almost there. When David finally reached the door, he didn't hesitate. He kicked it open with all the strength he could muster and stumbled inside, his legs buckling beneath him as he crossed the threshold. The warmth hit him like a wave, almost knocking him off his feet. He collapsed to the floor, cradling Alara in his arms. She was barely conscious now, her breathing shallow and erratic. "Come on, Alara," David whispered, his voice strained with desperation. "Stay with me." He could feel the weight of her body pressing against his chest, and for a moment, he was unsure if she could hear him. But then, slowly, her eyes fluttered open again. You saved me," she whispered, her voice weak, but filled with something that David couldn't quite place. "I don't know why, but you saved me." David looked down at her, his heart racing. "Because you're worth saving," he said quietly, his voice low and steady. The words felt right. They felt like the truth. As Alara's eyes closed again, her body still in his arms, David realized that this was more than just a rescue. It was a choice, and he would make sure she would live to see another day, no matter the cost. The warmth of the building was almost too much for David to handle after the brutal cold outside. His body, aching and exhausted, seemed to protest the change in temperature as the adrenaline slowly left his system. He sat against the wall, still holding Alara in his arms. Her breathing had steadied, but her skin was still icy to the touch, and her eyes remained closed. It wasn't enough. He needed to do more. "Come on, Alara. Stay with me," he murmured, brushing the hair from her face. The room was quiet now, the storm outside muffled by the thick walls. It was a small, abandoned shelter, but it was warm, and it would have to do. As he set her gently on the cot, David quickly scanned the small room. There was a fire pit, long since cold, and some basic supplies scattered around, but nothing to suggest anyone had lived here in years. He didn't have much to work with, but he had to make do. He grabbed a blanket from a nearby shelf and draped it over her, making sure to cover her shivering form. As he worked, he noticed how fragile she looked, her alien features delicate yet striking. Her skin, which had once glowed in the storm, now looked muted, as though the life had been drained from her. It hit him hard. This girl, this being from another world, was alone in a way he could never understand. Abandoned by her people, lost in a world that wasn't hers. David clenched his fists, his thoughts drifting. He couldn't fathom what she must have been through. She had been left to die in the storm, left to fend for herself by those who should have protected her. He couldn't even begin to imagine why. Was it because she was different? He glanced down at her face again, feeling a surge of protectiveness. He had to help her. There was no turning back now. He couldn't just let her be some casualty of a war between worlds he didn't fully understand. He wasn't sure what kind of being she was, but in that moment, she wasn't just some alien. She was a person who needed him. "Don't worry," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "I won't leave you." Hours passed, and the fire pit had long since been reignited. The warmth from the fire filled the room, but still, David sat by Alara's side, waiting, hoping she would wake up. As the minutes stretched on, the silence became unbearable. His mind raced. Had he made the right decision? Was she really worth saving, or was he just delaying the inevitable? He shook his head, banishing the thoughts. The answer didn't matter. He had made his choice, and nothing was going to change that. It wasn't long before he heard a soft sound, a small, weak groan. Alara's eyes fluttered open, and David let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. She looked up at him, her violet eyes blinking in confusion. "You're still here?" she whispered. I thought you'd leave." David smiled, though his heart was heavy. "Not a chance," he said softly. "You're safe now." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the crackling of the fire, Alara's eyes were still filled with confusion, but there was something else there now. Something deeper. Why? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why did you help me? David took a deep breath. Because you matter, he said simply. No one should be left out there to die, no matter who they are or where they come from. Alara's gaze softened, but there was still a wariness in her eyes, as if she couldn't quite trust the truth of his words. He knew it would take time for her to believe him, but that was okay. He would make her understand. As the fire crackled in the background, David knew this was just the beginning. There was a long road ahead, but for now, he would stay by her side. He would protect her. The storm outside was still raging, but inside, David and Alara were safe, for now. David sat by the fire, his eyes drifting between the crackling flames and Alara, who was still resting on the cot. She had finally fallen into a deeper sleep, her breathing more even now, though her face was still pale. He couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility growing inside him. She was alive, but there was so much he didn't know about her. So much about her world and her people that he couldn't begin to understand. He leaned back against the wall, eyes closing for a moment as exhaustion tugged at him. The journey had drained him, both physically and mentally. But despite the weariness in his bones, there was a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. He wasn't alone anymore. The thought startled him. It was strange to feel so connected to someone who wasn't even human. But there it was. He had chosen to help her, and that choice was still resonating within him. He hadn't expected it to feel like this. This need to protect her, to make sure she was safe. David's mind wandered back to the moment they had met. The storm had been brutal, and she had been so close to dying. He could have walked away, could have followed his orders, and left her to her fate. But he hadn't. And now, as he sat there, the weight of that decision began to settle in. What would happen next? What did she need? The storm outside had settled, and the quiet of the shelter gave David a moment of peace, though it was brief. A faint noise drew his attention, and he turned his head to find Alara's eyes open, gazing at him with that same intensity as before. You're still here, she said softly, her voice hoarse from the cold. David smiled, though his heart tightened at the vulnerability in her tone. I'm not going anywhere, he replied, his voice firm. She didn't respond immediately, but her eyes searched his face as if trying to understand something. Why? She finally asked, the word hanging in the air between them. David paused, considering the question. Why had he chosen to stay? He could have left, gone back to his mission, resumed the life he had known. But something in her, something in this situation, had pulled him in. He shook his head slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. Because you matter, he said simply. I couldn't just leave you out there. Alara's expression softened, and for the first time, David saw something akin to trust flicker in her eyes. It was fleeting, but it was there. Thank you, she whispered, her voice trembling. David nodded, his heart swelling with something he couldn't quite name. You don't have to thank me, he said gently. I'm just doing what anyone would do. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would have stayed. Not everyone would have made the same choice. I don't know if I'll ever be able to repay you, Alara said quietly, her voice barely audible. I don't even know if I deserve this. David looked down at her, his face softening. You don't need to repay me, he said, his voice calm and steady. Just focus on getting better. That's all that matters right now. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled in the background, and outside, the storm had finally quieted. The world beyond the shelter seemed distant, as though they were in their own little bubble, separated from the chaos of everything else. David didn't know what would come next, what would happen when Alara recovered, or what her story truly was. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of the unknown. He had made a choice, and no matter what happened, he would stand by it. Alara's eyes closed again, her body finally giving in to the rest it so desperately needed. As she slept, David leaned back against the wall, letting his own eyelids flutter closed. He wasn't sure how long they would stay here, or how long their journey together would last. But one thing was certain, he wouldn't leave her. Not now. Not ever. Days passed in the shelter, the fire crackling steadily as David kept watch over Alara. The warmth of the fire contrasted sharply with the cold world outside, and it felt like a small haven in the midst of the storm. Alara had started to regain her strength, her color returning slowly, though she still appeared fragile. Her eyes had softened over the days, and the wariness that once clouded her gaze had begun to dissipate. As David sat by the fire, he found himself staring at her more often, wondering about her past, about where she had come from. She had mentioned nothing about why she was abandoned in the snow, and he didn't push her. He knew that trust, especially in situations like this, took time. She had every reason to be cautious. One evening, as the storm raged outside, Alara stirred, her violet eyes opening slowly. She looked around the small room, then met his gaze. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice still weak but clear. David smiled, nodding. "You don't need to thank me. Just focus on getting better." She hesitated for a moment, then spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Her words carried a weight that David couldn't ignore, and for a moment, the silence between them was thick with unspoken emotions. He wasn't sure how to respond, but in that moment, he knew something important had shifted. He wasn't just helping her to survive anymore. They had connected on a deeper level, a bond formed out of necessity and compassion. Alara turned her gaze to the fire, her expression distant. David could sense she was struggling with something, but he didn't push. Instead, he simply sat beside her, offering her the comfort of his presence. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the shelter, there was a quiet peace, a moment of calm between the two of them. Time passed, and slowly, Alara regained her strength. She began to sit up more, to speak with more clarity. David found himself spending more time with her, listening to the quiet stories she shared when she felt ready. They were stories of a world far different from his own, a world of alien cultures and distant stars, but each story left David with more questions than answers. Yet, he was content to listen, knowing that, in her own time, Alara would tell him what she needed to. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Alara finally spoke of the past that had haunted her. "I wasn't always like this," she began, her voice shaky. "I had a home, a family. I was part of something greater. But things changed, and I was cast aside." David's heart ached at the pain in her voice, but he said nothing, allowing her to continue. "My people." Alara's voice faltered, but she took a deep breath and pressed on. They saw me as a failure, a weakness, and when they left me behind, I thought I would die there." David reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder, offering a silent reassurance. Alara looked up at him, her violet eyes meeting his. "I never thought someone like you would care," she said quietly. "Why would you? I'm not even human." David shook his head, his expression softening. "It doesn't matter. Everyone deserves a chance to live." For a long moment, the two of them simply sat there, the firelight flickering around them, the world outside forgotten for a while. Alara's words had brought clarity to both of them. David had made the right choice in helping her, and maybe, just maybe, he could help her find a new path, a new purpose. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let her go. Not after everything they had been through together. It had been a week since Alara had first opened her eyes in the shelter. The storm outside had finally passed, leaving behind a stillness that seemed almost surreal. The cold was still there, but it was no longer the oppressive force it had been before. Inside the shelter, things had settled into a quiet routine. Alara was recovering, her strength returning day by day. Though she still spent most of her time resting, she was starting to talk more, share more of her past, and slowly open up to David. David had stayed by her side, never once questioning his decision to help her. There were times when he wondered what would happen next. What was he supposed to do with the rest of his life? His mission had been left behind the moment he'd found her, and now, his future was uncertain. But as he watched Alara begin to regain her strength, something inside him told him that this was where he needed to be. He had made a promise to protect her, and he was determined to keep it. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Alara sat up in her cot, her back propped up against the wall. She looked over at David, who was sitting near the fire, sharpening his knife. "David," she said, her voice still a little raspy, but growing stronger. He looked up, meeting her gaze. "Yeah." She hesitated for a moment, then spoke, her eyes searching his face. "What happens now?" The question hung in the air between them. David set his knife down and stood, crossing the room to where Alara sat. He could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the way her shoulders were slightly tense. He knew she was asking more than just about the immediate future. She was asking about the path ahead, about where they would go from here. "We take it one day at a time," he replied honestly, his voice steady. "I'm not sure what the future holds, but I know this. No matter what happens, we're in this together." Alara looked at him for a long moment, her violet eyes searching his face, as if trying to see if he truly meant it. And when she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost hesitant. "Thank you." David smiled, a genuine warmth in his eyes. "You don't have to thank me." He took a step back, giving her space. "I told you I wouldn't leave you. That hasn't changed." She nodded, and for the first time in days, a faint smile tugged at the corners of her lips. It was small, but it was enough to tell David that, for the first time since they had met, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could trust him. As the fire crackled softly in the background, they sat in silence for a while, each lost in their thoughts. The future was uncertain, but in that moment, it didn't seem so scary. There was a sense of peace between them, a quiet understanding that they would face whatever came next together. The storm outside had passed, and with it, the heavy burden that had hung over their heads. And for the first time in what felt like forever, David allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was hope for both of them. The days grew warmer as the sun began to shine through the cracks in the shelter's walls, casting long beams of light across the floor. David had started to believe that they might survive this after all. Alara was recovering faster now, moving about with more confidence, her body growing stronger each day. She was no longer the fragile, broken girl he had found in the snow, and the spark of life had returned to her eyes. She even began to smile more often, a sight that warmed David's heart more than he expected. But despite her progress, there was still an underlying tension between them, a lingering question of what came next. They had both chosen survival, but at what cost? "David," Alara said one afternoon, her voice breaking the silence of the room. David, who had been mending some of their supplies, looked up at her. "Yeah." She was sitting near the fire, her hands folded in her lap as she looked into the flames. "What do you think is out there?" she asked, her tone distant, as if contemplating something deep. David followed her gaze toward the darkening sky outside. "I think there's a whole lot we don't know," he replied. "But it's not worth worrying about right now. We'll figure it out when we're ready." Alara looked at him then, her violet eyes searching his face. "And when will that be? When we're strong enough to leave?" she asked. "When we're ready to face the rest of the world?" David sat down beside her, the weight of her question settling heavily in the air between them. He didn't have an answer for her, not yet. He could feel her pain, her yearning to move forward, to leave the past behind. But how could he ask her to face a world she didn't understand, a world that had already betrayed her once? "I don't know," he admitted. "But we're not there yet. Right now, we need to focus on getting you back to full strength." Alara turned her head toward him, her expression softening. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm not sure I can ever go back. Not to the way things were." David's heart tightened at the raw honesty in her voice. He wanted to tell her it would be okay, that everything would work out, but he couldn't make those promises. Not with the uncertainty of their situation. "We'll face whatever comes together," he said quietly. "But for now, we take it one day at a time." There was a long pause before Alara nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do anymore," she said, almost to herself. David placed a hand on her shoulder, giving her a reassuring squeeze. "You're not alone, Alara," he said. "Whatever happens, we figure it out together." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face, as if looking for something. "And you promise that you'll stay with me?" she asked softly. David met her gaze, his voice steady and calm. "I promise," he said, his hand still resting on her shoulder. The weight of that promise hung in the air, and though he didn't know what the future held, he knew one thing for certain. He would never leave her behind. Not again. Not ever. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a quiet understanding, a moment where they both knew that, despite everything that had happened, they had something worth fighting for. And for the first time in what felt like a long while, both of them allowed themselves to believe in that future. Days passed, and with each one, David could feel the weight of their shared promise growing stronger. The shelter had become their home, a place of quiet solace from the harsh world outside. Though the storm had subsided, there was still a lingering tension in the air, a feeling of uncertainty that neither of them could escape. Alara was recovering well, her strength returning in small but noticeable increments. She had started to help David with some of the chores around the shelter, and the two of them fell into a comfortable routine. They spent their evenings by the fire, talking about everything and nothing. Slowly, the walls that Alara had built around herself began to crumble, and with every conversation, David found himself growing more attached to her. But despite the warmth they had found in each other's company, Alara's past still haunted her. David could see it in the way her eyes would cloud over when she thought he wasn't looking. There was something she wasn't telling him, something that weighed heavily on her heart. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Alara spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "David," she began, and he turned to look at her, sensing the change in her tone. "I need to tell you something." Her words sent a jolt of unease through him, and he set his mug down, giving her his full attention. "What is it?" he asked gently, his voice steady. She hesitated for a moment, as if choosing her words carefully. "I'm not just any alien," she said, her eyes avoiding his. "I come from a place of power, a place where I was once someone important." David remained silent, waiting for her to continue. He could feel the weight of her words, the hesitation in her voice, but he didn't push. "I was the heir to my people," she finally said, her voice soft. "I was supposed to lead them, to carry on the legacy of my family. But everything changed, and I was discarded." There was a catch in her voice, a sharpness that David had not heard before. He leaned forward, his expression softening. "What happened?" he asked, his voice quiet. Alara's eyes met his, and for a moment, they both sat there, the fire crackling between them. "I failed," she said simply, her voice thick with emotion. "I wasn't what they wanted me to be, and when they turned their back on me, I couldn't go back." David could see the pain in her eyes, the weight of her words heavy in the air. He wanted to reach out to her, to offer comfort, but he knew she wasn't ready for that. "Not yet. You're not a failure," he said softly. "No one is perfect. You're not defined by your past." Alara shook her head, a sad smile on her lips. "It's not that simple," she whispered. "I was supposed to be something, someone else. And now, I'm just," she trailed off, unable to finish her sentence. David's heart ached for her. He couldn't imagine what it must be like to carry the weight of such expectations, only to have everything crumble. But in that moment, he understood something important. No matter who she had been, no matter what she had lost, she was still here, still fighting. And that was what mattered. "You're here now," he said gently, reaching for her hand. "And that's enough." For a long moment, Alara didn't speak, but her hand slowly moved to meet his, her fingers brushing against his. The touch was soft, almost tentative, but it spoke volumes. They didn't need words to understand each other. They both had their burdens, their scars, but they were not alone. And for the first time, Alara looked at him, not with the hesitation she had shown before, but with something different. A flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could both find a way forward together. The days were growing longer, and with each passing one, Alara's strength continued to return. David had noticed the changes in her, not just physically, but in the way she carried herself. The quiet confidence she had once lost seemed to be coming back, piece by piece. She was more vocal now, more open, and it seemed like the weight of her past was finally lifting, even if just a little. Still, David knew there was more to her story, more that she wasn't ready to share. He didn't push her. He was content to let her take her time, knowing that trust couldn't be rushed. One evening, as the two of them worked together to gather supplies from the nearby storage cache, Alara spoke up, her voice clear and steady. "David, I think I'm ready to move on," she said, her eyes meeting his. David paused, his hand still holding the bundle of blankets he had just packed. "Move on," he repeated, trying to understand. Alara nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "I don't know what's out there, but I can't stay in this shelter forever. I need to face what's next, whatever that is." The words struck a chord deep within him, and David couldn't help but feel a mixture of pride and concern. He had known this moment would come. He had known that, eventually, Alara would want to leave. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low. "We don't have to rush into anything." Alara smiled softly, though there was a sadness in her eyes that David couldn't quite place. "I'm not rushing," she said. But I have to face my past. I have to find out who I really am now, without the weight of what I was supposed to be. David nodded, understanding the depth of her words. He had his own demons to face, and he knew how important it was to confront them in order to move forward. I'll go with you, he said, his voice firm. We'll face it together. For a moment, Alara didn't speak, but her gaze softened, and a flicker of something, relief, perhaps, passed through her eyes. You don't have to do this, David, she said quietly. You've done more than enough for me already. David shook his head, taking a step closer to her. I'm not leaving you behind. Not now, not ever. The words felt true, and as they stood there in the fading light of the evening, it became clear to both of them that they had reached a turning point. The past would always be a part of them, but it didn't have to define them. Alara's journey wasn't over yet, and neither was David's. They both had their own roads to walk, but they would walk them side by side. As the sun sank beneath the horizon, casting the world in soft hues of gold and pink, Alara took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her decision settling in. Thank you, she whispered. David smiled, his heart swelling with emotion. You don't need to thank me, he replied. You're not alone anymore. And with that, they both turned toward the future, ready to face whatever it held together.